and welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the first event in Drawing the Line series. My name's Kamala Kakaria. I'm the president of Seattle Print Arts. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Without the land, we would not have access to this conversation, and we thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. Join us in paying real rent, which goes to support the Duwamish Longhouse and cultural activities. If you're residing outside of the Duwamish territory, we encourage you to research the land you are on and find ways to support First People of the land that you are on. I'm thrilled to introduce our series discussion facilitator, Cleo Barnett, the Executive Director of Amplifier. Welcome, Cleo.
Hi everyone. So I'm calling in from Tongva Land in Los Angeles today, and I'm a filmmaker and an artist and a curator. I'm the Executive Director of Amplifier, and it's with my great honor to introduce two incredible people I've been very lucky to be able to collaborate with over the years. The incredible artists and cultural workers, Tracy Rector and Gregg. Deal. Hi, you two.
Hey.
Hey. So my first question today is really about the why. So I'm hoping that you two, as mark makers and storytellers, can share a little bit about why you do the work that you do. And I'm happy to go ahead and start by just grounding this conversation with the recognition that we are all on stolen land here in the United States. This land was built on slave labor. It was built, and that whiteness was a made-up racial construct, not rooted in a culture, but literally invented to position white people as superior in an extractive capitalistic system in order to really justify slavery, the stealing of indigenous land, the murder of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it was this murder, stealing, and slavery, which really is the backbone of wealth accumulation for white folks today. This is the framework that we all live within, that white people like myself benefit from. And I see my work really grounded in this space. My curatorial practice is very much about alchemy. So it's taking these ugly truths that have been systematically erased from the history books and really trying to bring them into our collective consciousness through beautiful artwork that creates an entry point or a portal to acknowledge our past, as well as to envision an equitable future where everyone has access to resources, not only to survive, but really to thrive. And then my private practice, my art practice, is really a gateway for my own unlearning, my own relearning, my processing, my healing. And it's really not just for me, but it's in community, because at the core of all my work is community. So Tracy, I'd love to kick it over to you. If you could share a little bit about what you do, but really why you do what you do.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Tracy, and I'm calling in from the traditional homelands of the Puyallup peoples and what's called Tacoma today. And so I essentially grew up here in the Pacific Northwest, but all my family is in New Mexico, Colorado, and Oklahoma. And growing up here, I guess we moved here when I was about 3. I've just always been kind of on the fringe. I was always the only brown person, the only person in my family that eats fish, because they don't really eat fish back home. Always had different stories from my cousins, you know, when I would go visit my grandma in New Mexico, and just had kind of, you know, these huge pop bottle glasses and these pigtails, and had a sense of just kind of always being alone and connected to the TV. I was just like always in front of, you know, watching Dr. Spock and all these old classics in black and white and just lived in this kind of surreal world of my own making as a way of escaping, but also as a way of belonging to a different space. And I really carried that through as an adult. You know, as a mixed race person, just oftentimes feeling as though I don't belong. And so my life has been a journey of figuring out how to belong or experiencing different aspects of who I am in different ways. And at times, strongly aligning with different cultural aspects of who I am in practice and then my lifestyle. And one thing that grounds me is, for me as a mixed race person, I see myself in the position of really being able to serve and be in service to community and to the different communities that you know, my ancestors come from, that make up who I am today. And so I love the idea of creating art in collaboration, creating art in community, creating art that exists on the outside of the norms, and always trying my best to dismantle systems and create new systems through my artwork and through my voice, which oftentimes means uplifting others and really practicing how I can not necessarily take a back seat, but be an advocate. Yeah, so I'll pass it on. Great.
Wow, that was all a lot, and I don't know if I can follow that. Well, I'm first off, I'm a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. I always say that I'm a husband and a father, and an artist and a disruptor. These are, you know, some of my identifying things. And I grew up in Park City, Utah, which is a strange thing to say because it's a ski resort town, is rich and highly privileged, and my parents made just enough money for us to be poor around rich white folks. And it was strange because we had all the issues of being broke, but we had all the privileges of living in a town like that. So I grew up skiing and snowboarding, which is just really strange. But my experience there was an incredibly difficult one. There were not very many brown people. My sister and I, and maybe one or two other people that I can think of, were, you know, prominently placed amidst a sea of privileged white kids, and they made sure we knew that. The result of that was connecting with things that were always sort of, I guess at the time they called counterculture or anti-social culture. So to me, it was always art, and it was always skateboarding, and it was always snowboarding, and it was always punk rock and hip hop, and all of these things that at the time had no place where I grew up. And so these became defining factors. And the idea that I could create art for a living was something that I hadn't even fathomed. I didn't understand how to get there. I didn't understand how to do that. And I think a series of perfect events, coupled with a little bit of trauma, put me on that path and put me in a place to be able to do that. My artistic practice is wholeheartedly meant for you to either love it or hate it, but always consider it. It is meant to oftentimes be a reflection of my own experience as a Native person, or likewise the experience of my children as I see things through their eyes. And always ultimately, and I don't know if I do this on purpose or not, as is the sort of state for people of color in the United States, that simply stating something immediately puts us into the realm of activism, which means that anything that we create ultimately acts as sort of a social mirror of the problems that exist for people of color and our experiences. That means that there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into the things that we do, while it is simultaneously the truth that we live every single day. So I consider myself to be a contemporary artist that just simply as making art from the perspective of my own experience and identity. Apparently that means something else to a lot of people. But I'm okay with that. You know, I do my best to traverse that and to always make sure that no matter what I do as an artist, that I'm being honest and I'm being true, not just for myself, but for my children and also for my community and for anybody um, that sees my work and feels a connection to it. So that's me.
Thank you. Thank you both. I wonder if we can start with kind of a light question, because I know this is quite a layered topic, just your inspirations. Like, where do you draw the inspirations from your work, whether it's popular culture or other artists or art forms? I know, Gregg, we've spoken about this a lot, so maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. Hey, this has been a process. So, you know, popular culture was sort of a starting place for me, mostly because of the complexities of identity. What we have access to now in terms of Indigenous identity is just completely different than what I had access to in the 80s and 90s. And so a lot of my early references are about things that I grew up with. And even still now, I'm still referring back to those things because they're terrible and colorful, and they make a bold statement about things that still exist, you know, stereotypes and inappropriate forms of identity. And so my work ends up being about identity. And so I'm looking at the things that have spoken to me as not just an Indigenous person, but also as an American, because I am a Native person that is having an American experience. But that path has also taken me through old photographs and working from old photographs, and then ultimately relying solely on my community in terms of like the types of textiles that I'm using within my work. And then marrying all those things together, you know, bringing the truth in there, bringing the imagery, and then allowing these textiles that are thousands of years old to also sort of exist in you know, two-dimensional spaces. With the performance work that I do, that I have, I think, a fair amount of accolades connected with, I almost primarily just pull from my experience. Like I'll make some references to pop culture so that there's at least a level of understanding, but it's way more subversive, I think, than other work, with the exception of my very first performance piece, The Last American Indian on Earth, which was very specifically me dressing as a stereotype, as a Native person in public. Most other ones have been definitely a little more subversive. But one of the biggest issues that I had growing up was feeling that I didn't have anything to draw inspiration from. Becoming older and, you know, doing the work and the research and realizing that there is just so much to pull from. The greatest myth is the society we live in convincing me, an Indigenous person who has a rich array of things to draw inspiration from, that to convince me that I have nothing to draw from, which has been sort of the great awakening for me within my work. So I think that answers the question.
That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I certainly have quite a bit of work that's media related, that's in filmmaking, but have done some kind of postering, you know, yard sign type of work as well. But I would have to say, you know, going back to being that pop bottle glasses kid sitting in front of the TV, growing up in the 70s, there were no mixed race people. There were no people who had the experience that I had on TV. The ones who kind of seemed like they did was Wonder Woman. She was from the Amazon. Dr. Spock, he was mixed race. David Carradine and Kung Fu. And I distinctly remember, you know, emulating and, you know, imagining myself living in those worlds, you know, everything from wearing Wonder Woman gear to, thinking about walking on rice paper and being very quiet all the time and just being an observer and just really paying attention to those lessons and thinking about how that characterized the way I see life. And for a long time, I recognized that my point of view was different and was unique. I always joke too, because I have a lazy eye, that just like my tilt, I think Van Gogh had a lazy eye too. Just the way I see the world is literally different than most people. But it wasn't until I got into 10 years of filmmaking that I realized I was a filmmaker, that way of seeing and that different perspective and point of view was valid, and it was a form of art. What I find interesting, I was a domestic violence counselor for 6 years, and what I appreciated most from that time was listening to the survivors, listening to the people, women and children who were, trying to find change in their life. And that deep listening is what I decided to really follow in terms of deciding to become a documentary filmmaker. But the art that attracts me is really that surreal, like kick-ass Nicolas Cage kind of aesthetic. And what I dream of, to be honest, is breaking out of these binds of documentary film that feels somewhat safe too, to create something that is non-conventional, brown, Coen Brothers, in your face, shaking it up kind of aesthetic. I do find that, about 6 years ago, I started learning about curation, art curation, and moving people through space, as well as AR and AI, and making my first virtual reality. I love the idea of, similar to myself with my lazy eye, like shifting people's perspective, making people feel uncomfortable by shifting the space around them. So it's been fun too, to not only curate art, but think about postering and disrupting space through projections, and that kind of expression too.
Wow, that's so cool. I love all the different facets of your work. Well, that kind of brings me to my next question so beautifully, which was talking more about the collaboration that the three of us embarked on with a number of other incredible creators. So last year, we all were able to collaborate on a campaign for Indigenous Peoples Day. And a major theme of the campaign was the intersection of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. And then a part of that collaboration was actually creating AR activated artwork. And I'll pop something in the chat so y'all can check it out maybe after this panel. But both of you collaborated. So Gregg created a number of artworks. And then Tracy, you were really the visionary behind, the entire campaign and the direction of the campaign. But then both of you got to collaborate on a bit of a spoken word piece that went with artwork that was AR activated. And Tracy, you collaborated with Nikita Oliver on one of the spoken art pieces. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what inspired the conceptual direction for the Indigenous Peoples Day campaign, and any sort of insights you want to share on this intersectional process.
Sure. So through my current work right now at Neotero, we focus on working in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, specifically to support, land back movements, land rights, guardianship, and thinking about the conservation space and learning that space. I've been there for about a year and a half. It's like the people in charge are 95% white men. It's a very white space, a conservation world. People of color, BIPOC people, Black people, Indigenous peoples have been pushed out and disenfranchised for a long time, but also women and non-binary persons. And so in thinking about that campaign, we really wanted to uplift the strength of Indigenous women as part of that, women who are guardians, women who are protectors, women who are moving change in the communities. And so that was the beginning space. And then with Illuminative, really encouraging thinking about getting the vote out. That was another opportunity to think about, how do we lead the way and how do we recognize leaders in their different forms, whether they're midwives or, aunties or, Deb Halens of the world, just that what that continuum of leadership can look like. And solidarity is huge. And that's something that, it's been a really hard year, 2020 in so many ways, but something I appreciate is the growing and maturing solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities and movements. So really bringing that into is important.
Yeah, thank you. And Gregg, I don't know if you want to build on that at all. I know that you were really instrumental in the spoken word piece that you and Mayor Young collaborated on. Yeah, do you want to speak a little bit to what inspired your writing?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I was young, the thing that spoke to me was seeing Black people on television, particularly MTV, and you start seeing hip hop coming up, finally getting a place on, MTV, which was very restrictive at one point to Black artists, and that spoke to me. And the first book I read from cover to cover was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And there's a reason why those things spoke to me then and still speak to me now. What's tough is trying to figure out where those lines are, if those lines are there at all in some cases, because there is a shared experience, I think, between Black and Indigenous people. I am inspired by the words of Malcolm X and of James Baldwin. And I am inspired by the power of Angela Davis, and these voices that are saying words that still apply today. Unfortunately, they're so relevant. But the power of those things obviously leak over into Indigenous struggle, and I would even see to a certain degree and far more subversive, I think, but Indigenous liberation, I think, would also be an appropriate way to put it. But I don't know, I was so excited to do that, but also so nervous because I do recognize that there has been an enormous amount of labor to figure out what these things are, what they mean. I mean, English, we pretend like English is so progressive. It's not. We're just in the last few years defining what non-binary is and what pronouns are and how those work. And so that's a long time for English to be in play, to not have a definition for these things that have had definitions in Indigenous communities for thousands of years. And so I think last year especially was a big wake-up call for Native people to be, I mean, we have to be honest, we're a group of people that were raised by white supremacist views, covered or masked by religion through boarding schools. And those Judeo-Christian ideals taught us that to be gay is wrong, to be trans is evil, to be Black is less than. And so our own communities needed to have like an honest conversation about the racism that has existed in our communities, that are things that have been fed to us. And I don't speak for the Black community, obviously, but I assume on the other end, there may have been some misunderstandings that also need to be rectified, because we're having an American experience that is a special brand of fascism and racism. And so you cannot deny the fact that we have been intertwined from the very beginning. You cannot talk about slavery without talking about Indigenous displacement. You cannot talk about colonialism without talking about slave trade and Indian removal. I mean, all of these things exist together. So when we put together what we put together, I was trying to follow that line. I actually spent several days reading and listening to James Baldwin, who's just so eloquent in the way that he speaks. Like, it just hurts my heart. And I was hoping to kind of capture something like that, because I wholeheartedly believe that there is just an incredible shared experience in United States history between these two peoples, and frankly, all the people in between too. I mean, we separate Mexicans from a lot of things, but the truth is they're indigenous, and they just suffered a different type of colonialism. And that colonialism separation, it shows up in the way that we treat people who are south of the border, and how we treat indigenous people. It's night and day how those two groups are treated. So sorry, I don't want to go on a tangent, so I'm done.
Oh, I love that. Something that was interesting too from those two AR pieces were that so many young people identify as Afro-Indigenous these days too. It's so many integrated, identities and cross-cultural realities. And so I noticed just on social media, a lot of people loving those because they saw those solidarity images as self-affirming, which I think is new too, and a kind of fresh way to be in community together.
That's beautiful. It's interesting looking at cultural appropriation, because you can look at it from so many different lenses, and it really does change depending on what country you're in, what position you're in within society. But I just kept coming back to power, of course, power imbalances, and then also seeing colonialism, capitalism as just an extraction culture. And especially for white people who got separated from any of their own cultural, like to become white, you got stripped of any cultural positioning at all whatsoever. And so the culture really became one of extraction. And then the other end of cultural appropriation that's really interesting to me is just looking at Western art that, all artists are kind of positioned within. And, from the 1900s to like 1940s, like the modernism period, it was all about kind of being this like individualistic lone wolf. Normally it's like a white guy like in the cabin in the woods that's tortured, and he's creating his art, and it's brilliant and it's original and it's deep and it's just this blessed thing. And then there was this interesting like postmodernism period of kind of Andy Warhol, where it was like, nothing's original, everything's already been created. So cultural appropriation actually became this art form that was celebrated with like Andy Warhol's, Campbell soup cans. And so and then I'm seeing that a lot today, especially in like the gallery world, like the contemporary gallery world. It's kind of like, to have hope that your voice can change the future is seen as like naive. And it's really like kind of looked down on. And it's like to have kind of no opinion and to create something that's just aesthetically pleasing and almost ironic, like ironic artwork is very celebrated. And I will say, I even went to an art show like recently, and it was gorgeous and beautiful. And I was so attracted and stimulated when I was in there. But then looking back on reflection, I was like, wow, what was this artist even actually saying and contributing? And it was very much just this like cool kid, like luxury kind of aesthetic. And I definitely really believe that every one of us has the power to change the world around us. Every one of us is contributing to culture. And to not believe that, who is that supporting and uplifting? And all of the artists who choose to be ironic and not take a stance, who are those people? And it's pretty clear, like when you kind of take a step back and look at it that way. So when I personally see other white people appropriating other cultures, I think on one hand, I'm like, wow, that is really sad that they don't have their own culture to draw inspiration from and to really go deep inward into their artwork to create an original expression. And then two, I feel like it's another colonial violence that's taking place, whether or not you see it or not. It's seeing a Black or Indigenous or person of color as an aesthetic, as something to be consumed and be inspired by, but not actually as a full person to like respect. And I think it's a reflection of us not having art forms that are tied to like cultural ritual, because we were totally severed from that. So I'm curious for each of you, and maybe Gregg, we can start with you. What's the line in terms of inspiration and cultural appropriation? Is there a clear line, or is it more vague for you?
Well, this is the gospel according to Gregg. So for me, it's a clear line. I actually went back to Park City a couple of years ago for the first time in like 20 years. And there's a lot of art galleries up there because it all fits in within that whole, Sundance Film Festival, ski resort, rich people aesthetic. That's an aesthetic, right? So I walked into a gallery and there's these paintings of profile paintings of Indians in headdresses. And the person who's painting them is a white guy. And I actually went and did all the research on him. And it turns out that he's just like, a Scandinavian white dude that just like loves America and loves the West, and it inspires him and it speaks to him. Straight up, I don't give a shit. Like, I really don't care. I mean, you can be inspired by something without pulling those things and applying your own lens through them. Because the moment that you do that, you've changed it. And so it's no longer coming from, it's not a story that's being told by the originators. It's a story being told by somebody else who's seeing it through a set of lenses that don't connect to the source. That's the most important thing. And we're at an age now where I feel like that I can just go ahead and say outward, our people should be telling our own stories, and you do not need to tell our stories for us. There's a couple of things aligned with that. One is just somebody speaking your stories for you is just erasing me altogether, or erasing my people, or whoever you want to say. But from an art perspective, this guy got into a gallery and is selling paintings for thousands of dollars in a gallery that I could never get into. Not saying that I would want to, but the principle is still there, that there are people that are not just telling our stories and erasing the original voices of these people, but they are benefiting from it. They are obtaining a massive amounts of money, and they're able to make a handsome living off of it. And so that kind of reaches into this other place of economic inequity, and how our stories don't mean as much if they don't come from our mouths. And if they do, it's commodified. That statement that I made earlier, that like, just because I say something is true that happens in my life, that immediately makes me an activist, because it's this unique thing that becomes commodified. So I think that there is a clear line. And I also think that there's plenty of history for Americans, or for anybody, to draw from. If you can't find something, you're not trying hard enough. And because I have to check myself when I'm creating work, or if I'm looking at images or textiles, if it's from a community that I don't belong to, I have to consider whether or not this is a good idea, because those images are somebody's grandparent or great-grandparent. They're living relatives of these peoples that exist. Those stories that you heard once have thousands of years of legs, and you just busted it down to a children's book because you heard it once. It's steeped in privilege, and it lacks the opportunity for a Native person to be able to participate on an equal level. And so when we're doing land acknowledgements, and when we're talking about contributing to First Peoples in the areas, that's not an arbitrary thing. Who are the Indigenous artists and makers that are in your spaces? Are you creating space for them to be able to tell their own stories and to share their own ideas? Are you enabling them in your workplace, in your schools, in your churches, in all of the spaces that we share with you? Do the Native people in your community feel like that they're even part of your community, or do they feel like that they're on an island in which they have to code switch to survive? And so these are very real things. I can tell you the neighborhood that I live in, I'm on an island and I'm not honest. Like, people that I live around have no idea what I do and would probably be pretty upset if they did. It's a very Trump area, but that means that there's not a place for me. So in my mind, cultural appropriation isn't just this idea of taking something or being inspired by something. This is something that goes all the way back to first contact. It goes all the way back to deciding the value of a human life, of a culture, of a language, of a tradition, of a story. It goes all the way back to boarding schools, where boarding schools have made statements that your culture isn't good enough, that convincing children that if you speak your language, I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap and I'm going to beat you until you stop speaking it. These things are all connected. So it's not just like mascots and patterns on underwear through retailers, or any of the other many things that have happened over the years. Every last one of those things that people think are trivial are connected to a historical pattern of erasure. And we're now in a place, and we have, social media has been a big help with that, obviously. We're now in a place where nobody has an excuse. If you're appropriating our stories, our wares, our languages, if you're inspired by it and you are not of that community, you're a problem and you're not trying hard enough. So it's a hard line, I know, but deal with it. I don't.
Thank you for that. Yeah, for me, it's interesting. It's someone who I was just posting this recently on IG. I kind of figured out from like ancestry.com, I probably come from 20, by today's standards, 20 different distinct cultural communities and nations. And that is, my era, being 49 years old, that's not as normal as it is incredibly normal today for young people, millennials especially, to have, go beyond a biracial experience, but this incredibly nuanced, multicultural, multifaceted reality. And so I've been thinking a lot about what is cultural appropriation, for a person similar to myself that's so integrated. And like I said earlier, right now I am focusing heavily on being a support person, but also beginning to think about what does it mean to, and I was recently told that mixed race realities and studies is not legitimate. And so of course that made me be like, ooh, I'm gonna go after that and think about that and work on that. What does it mean to be a mixed race person creating art, telling stories, stories, having conversations, having narrative, taking up space? And I'm really looking towards the young people right now to understand what those conversations look like and can be, because I think they're going to lead the way. There's different examples around the world, like in Morocco, I went there, and that's what, tens of thousands of years of cultural mixing. And it's, for me, it was the first time that I felt like I belonged. And it was interesting, that centering space, even though it was completely outside of my culture, but physically and visually, I felt like I belonged. And how I was able to relax in that moment, I never felt before or since. So I'm curious about, how do we, from my perspective, get to that space as mixed race people where we can begin thinking about a new aesthetic, a new art, a new voice that comes from that space that's not appropriating culture, but comes from this new dynamic that's happening.
That's really interesting. So my father's white. I'm half white and I'm half Native, and I identify as being Native. because that's how I've always been treated. And but I also am in this other place. Well, once my father asked me, he says, you're half white. Why don't you ever tell anybody you're half white? And I'm like, it never comes up. And he's like, well, I think you should tell people you're half white. And I'm like, well, Dad, I speak English and I wear Western clothes and I live in a Western house. I don't know how much more white you want me to be. But the fact is that this is so complex and so interesting, because I identify as being Native, and even like in museums I've had my work in, and they ask you what they want the tag to say. And I'm not poo-pooing anybody that puts like every tribe that they belong to or every bit of their identity, but mine will say Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, and that's it. Because the old way used to be that if I married somebody from Shoshone and then we went and lived on Shoshone land and we had children, and we would just be Shoshone. That's just the way that it was. And so I've got about 4 different tribes in my line. But based on that idea, the Western construct of blood quantum and everything else, this is the community I belong to, as dictated by the next male in my line, which is my grandfather, and that's just the way that I identify. But at the same time, I cannot deny the fact that I am influenced by the white half of me, and who comes from the South, or even just the American experience, which is also a very sort of, European sort of, I don't know. It's so complex and so interesting, because I think we are all pretty well mixed. But I just wanted to say that because I just think it's interesting looking at that complexities and how that works, and for me, this is what it's always been. And it'll be interesting for my kids who are very white passing, but purely identify as being Native and are enrolled members of our tribal community, and how they're going to traverse this. I worry for them about that. But yeah, it's complex as hell.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple of months ago, I felt like I was coming out. I was like, I was excited because I found out I was part Scottish. And I was like, I don't know, what are the protocols around, identifying as Scottish, and just like asking for help, especially from, Native friends, like what, who also have Scottish heritage, and like, am I able to like look up tartans and like all of these questions. It's interesting, these kind of Western constructs, yet these really important traditional protocols around identity. And it becomes incredibly complicated when we start talking about appropriation, because like, where is that line?
Yeah, and then on my end, I'm 7th generation from California and 5 generations from New Zealand. And so for me to claim like French roots, I'm like, whoa, I just I don't feel anything tangible. I'm excited to go. Like, that's actually one of the reasons why I relocated to Los Angeles, is because I have such rich family history here, but I've never lived here before. And so trying to get closer to the land and see where it takes you. I don't know, as a fully white European, as a European person, it definitely feels like I'm starting to put myself back together again. And even though the process has had a lot of pain along the way, which is like totally minor compared to the everyday experiences of Black and Indigenous and people of color in the US, it feels more truthful and honest to actually really look at that history and really own it and say like, okay, like this is the past that I come from. How am I going to change my actions today to help shape the future?
I think that's decolonization for white folks. I mean, we talk a lot about colonization and how damaging that has been to Black and brown bodies, but it has this other thing that happened. I mean, John Trudell speaks about this beautiful concept of people in Europe being tribal people and coming from those spaces and living on that land and having a relationship with that land. And that the thing that demolished those is monarchy and religion. and that the identity and the relationship that you had within those tribal units were stripped away, to the degree that when Columbus sailed to, you know, to the Bahamas, the Haiti and the Dominican Republic is where it is now. He sees these people and they're human beings. Like indigenous people, we have all these words that just either mean the people or means human beings, because we're just human beings. And he sees these human beings and he doesn't recognize what he's looking at. He's looking at a human being and doesn't understand what he's seeing because they're so far removed, creating these other identities that are reliant upon a consumer set of ideals of monarchy and religion. And I kind of look at that, you know, and in that decolonization process, even for white folks, that like I've known a few white folks in my day that they love to go to a sweat lodge. They love to talk to Native people and to participate in, or want to participate in, these sacred ceremonies that honestly they have no business being at. And but I think the reason why that happens is because there is beginning to become a realization of being stripped away from the things that you know are true. You've been stripped away from your homelands and you don't recognize what's there, and you're trying to connect with something. How the hell do you do that when colonization has been so incredibly devastating to everybody, including white folks who came here and abandoned their ethnicity so that they could assimilate to survive? And that's just crazy. That's completely crazy. But I think, yeah, John Trudell said that, and it's sort of a beautiful set of circumstances. It actually gives me more compassion for that as well, for the plight that, you know, white folks who've lost their ethnicity when they came to this country are under.
And I think that is so key for the conversation about cultural appropriation, is you're reaching outward and copying and taking and then earning money from something outward versus going through the often painful journey of looking inward, looking at your people, looking at the history, and creating from that space.
And the disease that happens that's rooted in greed, capitalism, class, which is really at the basis of all of this.
Yeah, I know we're kind of coming towards the end, and I had a specific question for Tracy. I know my first encounter with your work was the Yeehaw exhibition at King Street Station. And then I also had the experience of, well, we'll just start there actually. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to how you go about working in community as a facilitator. I know there was a question in the chat around how can you be inclusive in your art without being appropriative? And I feel like how you work in community and provide platforms to others, but also just the whole process you went through with curating that exhibition was really, really inspiring.
Yeah, I would say I would give the biggest props to Asia Till, who's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, who's really the brainchild behind all of that. And I just felt honored that she asked if I would be willing to contribute in any way. And so Saprit, Colon, and myself, and many others really helped to make that space possible. And it was with a lot of, I would say, generosity and courageousness from all of us in terms of negotiating with the city and really demanding for there to be a new way of curation. And our I would say, approach was, so what happens if everybody who applies is accepted? And just like, oh, that blew people's minds. Like, what? But what if the work's not good? It's like, you know, our answer is, well, who's to say what's good or not? You know, there's this other aspect of really talking through what does it mean to be creative versus an artist, because there's many people who wanted to apply but said, I'm not an artist. Like, but you make these beautiful baskets, you know, you do this incredible weaving. Well, I'm not an artist, I just do that. And so just making time to go to communities, to sit with community, and to understand the power of words and what has happened in the art world and how these words have created gates. So just like really, thinking about those kind of norms and tearing those down, stripping those away, being willing to say no, to say yes, to be upfront about our needs and not back down. It was an incredible experience. But also, I have to admit, I'm always learning. I'm learning all the time and learning how to be better, do better, present better. So with that experience, I was just grateful to be, in all honesty, led by Asia in the process.
It was well, first of all, there was a line out the door. So congratulations. When I went, I was just like, whoa, this is amazing. And it was, it felt so, like I felt like grounded while reaching to the sky, while knowing all the directions around me. Like it just felt so rich and layered. So bravo to the full team there.
It was fully community supported, integrated. We asked for permissions along the way, everything from the name, going to the family whose story that we were requesting permission to use, just everything about it, really thinking about relationships. And I think that is at the heart of it, is that we put in the work, and not everybody puts in the work.
Yeah. So when it's like, how can artists be inclusive? It's like, well, you build long-term relationships with people. And I know, so
it's easy.
yeah, and it takes time. And normally, I mean, so my own experience, kind of, well, I'm not going to tell you my whole life story, but when I moved back to the United States, I got scouted to help bring Amplifier to life, and Gregg was one of the first artists I worked with. And Gregg, your lovely self, I felt like we had a bond straight away. But kind of the story I was going to tell is that, I've been doing this work now for almost 5 years, and it's like, I think people are starting to trust me now 5 years in. And I think just my invitation to people that are maybe new to this sort of work is keep showing up. And it's okay to make mistakes, but be accountable to them and like keep showing up, because trust isn't immediate right away. And especially, like, it's hard to trust white people. Like, sorry, but that's just kind of where we're at. So, but Gregg, I wanted to talk with you a little bit. So, you know, I flew to Washington, D.C., and I got to spend a weekend with you. You were one of the first artists I ever got to work with in the U.S. And I was recording you doing like public art installations around Washington, D.C. for the Change the Name campaign. Like, we printed a bunch of posters and did installations. And then I actually got to go to my first ever tailgate party with you, where I remember that. Like,
it was my first too.
And I recorded Gregg interviewing people about the Change the Name campaign at a tailgate party in Washington, D.C. And I know that that's been quite an interesting journey for you, because the name did get changed. So it was successful, which was really incredible, to help play a very small role in that. But you were working on this for a really long time. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why you created the artwork that you created, and then like lessons learned, because now that artwork is retired. Like, we've taken it off our website, we've taken it down, which is really the first time that we've ever had an artist come to us and be like, hey, this artwork actually isn't appropriate to be in the world anymore. And we had to talk about that. I wonder if you can just share a little bit about that journey.
Yeah. Well, I kind of landed in this because my very first performance piece, which I think is probably the piece that put me on the map as an artist, and was about stereotype and identity and perception, like outside perception of Indigenous identity. When I actually ended up on a local news station, it was News Channel 8 in Washington, D.C., and their studios are they're in Arlington, which is just on the other side of the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And I remember having the discussion with my wife about the mascot debate, because I actually was dealing with a lot of that in college and was participating in that discussion in college, and had sort of abandoned it a little bit because it was really a lot of emotional labor to put into that. And then when, we had kids, and then this art thing happened. And so I knew I was going on this news station, and I knew they were going to ask me about it. And the day that I did it, I didn't even realize it was actually opening day. So they asked me to come live on the news on opening day for the Washington Redskins. And I don't play around with football for that reason. And so I show up, and so they're asking me about my art piece, and then they're like, so what do you think about the name? And I knew they were going to ask that, but it was still kind of a put me on the spot. So there was a correlation, obviously, between talking or having an art piece about stereotype and this issue. And I found through that whole process of that performance piece that it didn't matter where you came from in the world, that when somebody saw me in a headdress and in the entire outfit that I wore for that, they immediately associated that with the Washington football team. And so that became part of the process, and I started creating work around it. So I created this piece. It's sort of and I just totally blanked on her name. There's a woman designer that does like Helvetica red and white, kind of looks like the Supreme. Just totally blanked on her name.
Barbara.
You know who it is? Yes, Barbara Kruger. So it's red background with white type, and it has a listing of racial slurs for every ethnicity at the time I think I could think of. And then I put a line through every single one of the racial slurs. It was just meant to be a visual representation of, like, if you use these words, you're a certain type of person. Like, we all understand that if you say the N word, you're a certain type of person. And the last word on the list was redskin, and it wasn't crossed out, to denote that this is the last major racial slur that you can say in public without any consequence. You could say it at work and you won't get fired. And at the time it was interesting because there's a lot of talking points in the news and just all this. It was a lot of hyperbole around it, and social media had amplified it quite a bit. And when I had created this, it made me cringe, and I know why it made me cringe. But your predecessor encouraged it, and so that's where it came from. So it was a sticker with racial slurs on it. I can probably dig one out too, and that's what it is. And when I mentioned earlier about how language, we're like developing language and we're developing understanding, at the time that I made this, we weren't having a discussion about lateral oppression, and we weren't having a discussion about what something like this means. And it has become clear to me that using racial slurs of other people to make my point is not appropriate. It's not an appropriate thing to do. At the time, it played a pretty big role in connecting the dots for a lot of people, particularly people of color, because Washington, D.C. is a chocolate city. And so their words, not mine. And so there was an interesting way to sort of connect the dots and use something visual instead of talking points that are regurgitated again and again and again. We had something visual that spelled out that, like, you don't say these words, but you can still say this word. Now, of course, the Washington football team, has retired the name. They completely missed the sort of moral lesson with it, but okay, they changed the name. And so we retired the piece, or I specifically pulled the piece to retire it. Because not just because they changed the name, but also because this lateral oppression is defined and not appropriate. In our discussion, you got to be more creative. So this was originally created in 2013, and was sort of plastered all over DC for the next several years. I had a small team of people that were putting them up everywhere, every month or so. So I think that's the whole story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing kind of the evolution of your thinking on that and being vulnerable with that. It's really beautiful. And I remember when we met in person, you were kind of like, this probably isn't going to ever change. Like, they've invested too much money into this. Like, and so it just goes to show that, again, our voice does matter. We can change consciousness. The art you create does matter. It contributes to the collective. So we have to take a responsibility in that. I know we're at time, but I do have just one more question I'm hoping I can ask. And I want to share that. So this is a 4-part series. This is the first of 4 conversations. The Seattle Print Arts community has been so thoughtful in putting this together. There's actually going to be discussion groups that will be, like, anyone that's attending today can join these discussion groups between each panel if you want to kind of have a voice and be in community. And so we'd just like to let everyone know that these discussion groups are gonna be hosted by the president of Seattle Print Arts, Cleo Barnett, and they're gonna take place next Wednesday. So please join, and we'll send you all a follow-up email with more details. So just my one last question, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I don't currently have children. Hopefully one day I will, but I feel like I'm around a lot of my mentors and peers have children, and I see how much legacy really shows up in their work, which has helped me kind of think about legacy in my own work, which I just think is really powerful to, like, see where you come from and also know that the work that you're doing today, you're not going to necessarily see the impacts of, but it is going to leave a legacy. So Tracy, I'd love to just start with you to ask, how does legacy show up in your work? And do you have a compass today that's kind of like steering you at this stage of your journey?
I just wanted to point out, thank you, Gregg, for mentioning Black Lives Matter and this shift for changing the name. And I love that Indian Collective and Illuminative, they all acknowledge that too very publicly. And that's where our intersections really hold one another up and create different forms of liberation and strength. Yeah, so young people and legacies. I have 2 young people. My oldest is an activist and a live streamer, and has been really embedded in and leading a lot of the defund police movement here, but across the country too. They also identify as non-binary and have been really active in thinking around kind of gender norms, safety issues, and just the experiences and the voices of young people today. And I'm constantly learning. And so I feel grateful to be in a relationship with them, because it does help my practice and helps me to grow and helps me to let go of ego and lets me realize that there's always a new way of moving forward in a good way, and being humble and learning. And then my youngest, I feel like I want to crack a joke, because last night he was talking about how on Tinder now you can like check a mark if you're vaccinated. And just like the humor that young people can bring too. It's like this fierceness and this humor, and just being able to, appreciate that as a mom and how that impacts my artwork. Sorry for joking about that, but I did find it was funny. It's just like, oh man, we are living in different times, and what's going to come out of this moment where there's been such immense artwork created, so many voices heard, so much writing, and just, I feel like I've been in absorption mode. It's been a traumatic year, but I think through trauma comes a certain type of vulnerability that leads to transformation too. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but at the heart of what I feel to be true is just surrounding myself with young people and being humble enough to listen and learn from their experiences, and understanding that this is a good way forward for me and how I can become a better artist and creator in the future.
Oh, gosh. I feel like this question is saying that I'm old and that I am supposed to be at a point in my life where I I think I was filled with a lot of piss and vinegar at the beginning, to be honest. And I feel like I've been able to let off that just a little bit, in terms of realizing that there are young people in the driver's seat right now. And I'm really happy to just sit back and let that happen. I've got 5 kids, which is kind of like having a million. And my oldest is 14, she's almost 15. And she's so mindful and so progressive. It's just, she catches me off guard. She said the other day she was in school, and there was a kid that was just spouting off at the mouth, and he was saying, I will never use pronouns. It's stupid, and I will never do it. And my daughter just answered one simple question. She said, I mean, so genius, because he used a pronoun to say that he was not going to use pronouns. And so that's just like, that's where she's at. And I just love her for it. She's so smart. And so I'm trying, like, there was a time where I'm just making work, but now, especially being surrounded by my own children and trying to surround myself with other young people, or at least trying to facilitate, to give my resources to other people so that they can benefit from those things, that I find myself being in check and trying to think through things more critically, because that critical lens has gotten a whole lot finer detailed over the last decade or so, and I'm grateful for that, because it challenges me, and I want to be better, and I need to be better. And I'm lucky to have at least one kid. My other one is like 12, so he's right there. He's almost there, and kind of forming those opinions in strong ways. But yeah, she's just a little rock star. She wants to be an artist, and I'm doing everything I can to give her every opportunity that I didn't. So I think my family's always been my compass. I'm paying attention to the world we live in, and I'm also learning to just back up and just let somebody else. Sometimes I don't have to be involved in everything. I can try to facilitate and try to help those young voices, or new voices even, to come forward and have opportunities to say things. And Amplifier actually kind of taught me some of that too. Like, I don't have to participate in every single issue that comes about. And forcing art doesn't necessarily make good art either. So it's good to just take a step back and be deliberate. I hope that answers your question.
I was also thinking in terms of legacy. I often ask myself, what kind of ancestor do I want to be? That way too.
Yes, thank you both so much. It's such a joy to be able to take this time. And I feel like another element of the decolonization, or kind of post-capitalism movement, is to not always be producing, not always be creating, and to slow down, to just be in community with one another and have these conversations. I know you both are really busy and have a lot going on, so thank you so much for spending an evening with us. And thanks so much to everyone who attended. I see a lot of beautiful comments in the comment section. So thank you all. And hopefully that we'll continue to be on this journey together over the next 4 months. So yeah, thank you. And thanks to Seattle Print Arts for creating this platform.